Before I go into detail about this occurrence, I'd like to clarify a few points for the listener. First and foremost, what I'm about to discuss happened. By an extension of the imagination, I'm not a liar. In fact, I despise falsehoods. That being said, you have my word that I'm not a fiction storyteller. So, be assured, you're not wasting your time. Furthermore, I take delight in providing them with accurate and true information. This also means resisting the urge to embellish, despite strong emotions. Second, like so many others who've shared their stories here, my experience has profoundly altered me, and it has been difficult to stay objective while discussing it. Finally, I'd like to acknowledge that the nature of this event is unusual. In fact, I've never come across anything like that when reading other stories, here or elsewhere. However, it is not what most people would consider a real NDE, though I cannot rule out the idea that it was also life-threatening in contrast. My experience. When I was 23, I was living in Oklahoma City with my grandma. At the time, I was a student and a part-time truck driver. I recall coming home from college one afternoon feeling quite drowsy. I walked upstairs to my room and lay down. As I waited to fall asleep, there was little to no delay. I do recall falling asleep eventually. That's my issue. I occasionally have sleep paralysis. I'm not a fan of sleep paralysis. While I've heard that some people like lucid dreaming, a type of REM sleep, I can't stand not being in control of my body when I recognize I'm not. When I notice I'm sleeping, I must always wake up due to intense anxiousness. I want to be clear that I don't experience anxiety symptoms while suffering from sleep paralysis for any other reason than not being in control. No dread of demons, fairies, Loch Ness, or anything else. On this specific instance, after being afflicted by sleep paralysis, I awoke after a customary 15 to 20 seconds. Despite the fact that the event is terrifying, I simply decide to relax and succumb to exhaustion. I was paralyzed again in an astonishingly short period of time, so I fight to wake up after another 15 to 20 seconds. This cycle of falling asleep and re-emerging from sleep paralysis occurred 4 times in all. On the third occasion, I had grown tired of these occurrences to the point where I felt I needed a solution. I needed to think of anything, because my tension was at an all-time high and I was frustrated. The sleep paralysis itself was too mentally draining, and I was determined to find out whether there was a better technique to speed up my awakenings after episodes of sleep paralysis. Then it hit me. I realized I needed to change the way I tried to wake up. That is, to shift from a stymied, gradual battle to awaken, to releasing a determined, welled-up torrent of effort in order to do so immediately. If I did it correctly, it would be a one-time emergence. With this easy strategy in mind, I attempted to fall back asleep as I relaxed, and I was consciously asleep in no time. I couldn't believe how quickly these occurrences kept repeating themselves. I was disappointed, but I was as prepared as I could be. I started thinking about what I needed to do almost immediately. Anger at my persistent circumstance welled up within me. It held my anxiousness in check as my strategy to focus against my fear went ahead despite it. Many lengthy seconds went by. I saw myself growing more powerful in order to succeed at an activity that my cynical mind predicted would fail. But I knew I had to give it a shot. Oh, but it worked. I imagined that if one person became aware quickly, others would follow. While I was paralyzed, I would eliminate some of my fear of falling asleep and a great deal of terror. If that was the solution I needed, I was going to focus on it with such intensity that I would have sprung not just out of my slumber, but also maybe out of my bed. If I had anything to say about it, I was going to be the master of my situation. It was finally time to turn over a fresh leaf. Finally, I thought the time had come. I was completely resolved. I began counting down from 5. I lunged with everything I had when I reached 0. Instead of regaining, or simply not regaining control, reality checked its bag and greeted me with something electrical. My eyes popped open. My ears were tormented by what sounded like an explosion, followed by a persistent tone. As what appeared to be lightning coursed through me, I could practically feel my muscles twitch. I knew I was awake because I could see my ceiling, but when I tried to move, I rapidly realized I couldn't move a muscle as I peered above. Everything I heard seemed to die away. Something began to form in front of my face in a matter of seconds. I looked around furiously. What on earth is going on? It was there for me to see, plain as day, after a few moments. It was only a box. I was struck by both belief and disbelief. It appeared to be about a foot away from my face. I was perplexed as to how this could be happening. I knew I could see, and there was no way this could be a dream, delusion, or disillusionment. But how is this possible? After a few moments, I saw it was encircled by something. Clear, flowing, strong speech rolled over my ears before I could discern anything else. Terror struck me like 1,000,000,000 tons of bricks. I couldn't move my body, but I also couldn't move my eyes. I had to stare at it. Despite the fact that I had no desire to learn anything else, I yanked with everything I could muster. I yanked, yanked, yanked. There was not even a twitch of the eye. Although I had my senses, it appeared that my body was completely crippled and divorced from my desires. As my inability to modify the circumstance persisted, so did my speech. As I stared, whoever was delivering the speech droned on. Obviously, I didn't hear any English, but it didn't sound like any other recognizable speech I'd ever heard. It didn't even sound like a man was saying it. It sounded cold and forceful at the same time. There were no spaces between the syllables. The address was direct, loud, and moving. It was undeniably genuine. When you see, hear, and feel it, you know it's real. This was it, I thought. I wasn't going to make it out of this one alive. I was dead. Later that evening, my grandma would come up the stairs. She'd always knock on my door and inquire where I'd been all day. She'd discover me in my bed and wonder why I wasn't responding. As I gave in, the concept repulsed me. There was no other option. As I began to accept my seeming fate, which I felt was undeserved, I became more aware of what I was looking at. That was obviously the object that surrounded the cube. It was so captivating because it radiated pure white light. Folks, I'm not sure what I saw in general, but I can tell you that this object was a halo through and through. The white light was soothing to the eyes while still being all-encompassing. As I peered at it, it occurred to me that I had no idea what a halo was meant to be. As I became focused with it, I found myself feeling relieved. I returned my focus to the cube a few moments later. As I scanned, it, or whatever was responsible for the speech, droned on. The item appeared to be dark and translucent. There was some lettering, or anything on the surface here and there. It seemed like it was writing, but in little, constrained spaces. The lettering emerged as individual glyphs, but I didn't have nearly enough time to absorb it. The speech came to a halt before I could reach any conclusions about the writing. When the speech ended, I felt my terror return in full force. My focus shifted away from the nuances I could detect, and I reverted to my deer-in-the-headlights, don't-run-over-me persona. In some sick way, I had the impression that my final rites had been read to something or myself, and that this was the end. Why bother saying something that no one could understand? Was it, in fact, speaking to me? I was terrified of what would happen next, but as I waited, nothing happened. Everything remained still for a few seconds. The vision then faded into nothingness. I battled once again once the box vanished. As I yanked for my release again, I felt a renewed sense of possibility. Then I watched as my eyes closed in on me. This was just another bizarre event to add to the collection. I was back in the darkness in no time, as a result of a typical sleep paralysis event. Despite the fact that I generally dislike the standard sleep paralysis scenario, I had forgotten to feel that way. A traditional sleep paralysis episode was something I was trying to avoid, and I succeeded. Something unusual happened to me when I came from the event. It took some time for me to regain full control of my body. In fact, before I awoke, I was planning on leaping out of bed, breaking through the door, and sprinting down the stairs to the first shelter that struck me as adequate. However, as my eyes gradually opened, I noticed that the rest of my body was lagging in an unusual way. I started with my head, then my neck, my chest, my abdomen, and so on. I gradually regained control, from my head to my toes. I was once again astounded. My body was not available to me at the same time. I questioned what could cause that to happen right now. It took a few seconds while I yanked on muscles that weren't paying attention. It all left me completely perplexed. After I was given everything back, I decided that fleeing the scene was pointless. I knew I was back in command. As I sat on my bed, contemplating proof of a greater power, there was a rather loud ringing in one of my ears. This encounter has clearly altered my essential convictions about life, in my opinion. The incident demonstrated to me that I'm not entirely in control of my life, and that it is most likely an illusion. What else would I eventually learn about the event at the time it occurred? I had no idea, but I had sincere doubts that anything could be learned. Many years have gone, and I've discovered things are remarkably telling in describing things. Believe it or not, there are leads on the internet that can help explain aspects of my narrative. If you trust me to some extent, I believe you'll find these leads interesting.